Now, we haven't done everything in clustering, but in our case, working with these Docker images or Docker containers, we actually have involuntarily fixed one problem that you otherwise might have if you just configure completely different machines. Clustering the document repository. It's actually the document store, rather, because when you think of Liferay running on two machines, let's say now really iron servers, you have one server, you have another server, and they all are completely self-contained. Both Liferay instances would store their documents somewhere in the file system, and by default in Liferay home data document library. If you look at your own local host installation that you can just start up on your server, that's where you can find it. Liferay home data document library by default. Now you can imagine that this fails hard if you upload something to server number 1 and then you try to download it from server number 2, which means we got to do something. And involuntarily, as we are working with these Docker images that use the same volume underneath, we have already fixed it. We're just running on a single server. They have access to the same file system, so we won't run into this issue. However, it's worth noting that this is actually really required to have both of them store their data in the same document repository. So node 1 and node 2, in this case, need access to the same file system. And I've covered that a little bit earlier when we discussed the document library. We can do so by just pointing them to the same directory. We can also do them by pointing to the same database and store in our relational database. Works quite well, and both have access to the same relational database anyways. And then here it says we can take 3 different approaches to cluster our document repository. This is basically the 3 different places where we can configure it: system settings, configuration file, and portal X properties. Simple file system store is the next slide, and I would like to use this as my segue into the configuration. This is actually a configuration that you want to do no matter if you cluster or not. I've given you a hint in the document library section already. The simple file system store is our default, is Liferay's default. So it stores a local, or it uses a local folder to store all of its binary files and all of its versions. And we would require this to be done on a shared drive anyways. However, while we are configuring this, I want to give you the reason why you actually want to change it anyways, no matter if you cluster or not. As a bare minimum, you want to go with the advanced file system store. Reason is, file system store, a simple file system store, uses a single directory and stores all of its data in there. I can't give you the exact number where they will fail, but most of the current file systems will fall flat on their face with a certain amount of files. And that's one of the reasons why the ancient Unix mail spool directories actually span a tree of different directories and then spread all of the files in many different directories. That's where they scale well. There are file systems that can handle the simple file storage well, but they're not really the common ones. In other words, if you risk people using your document library, let's hope they do, just use advanced file system store if you go for the file system, or use any other store but not simple file system store. I would say it's a good way, this is my good way, to add a feature request to just change the default to a different one anyways. I don't really see a reason for the simple file system store unless you just install it in a demo system. But I'd rather explicitly enable it than explicitly disable it. Now, here we have to enable, you can go to Advanced File System Store in System Settings, and then you'll find them in Foundation. There's also a neat search where you can just search for the store. and just configure the location. In our case, the location is actually fine because that points to one of the volume directories that we get mounted in anyways. And in order to then enable the file system store, the advanced file system store, you can edit Portal X properties and change to, and here's where you just give the class name, advanced file system store, and of course restart so that the setting takes effect. Unfortunately, again. Now, if you have any data in your document library, then you got to migrate up front, and all of the steps that you need for migration are actually in the exercises. So as far as I know, you even need to migrate if you don't have any data, because we'll need the basic infrastructure there in your folders that Advanced File System Store finds everything. But it's all laid out in the exercises, so everything you need, because we're going to activate it, everything you need is in your exercises documentation. Alternatively, you could connect to your SharePoint, you could connect to your Alfresco, you could connect to your Documentum installation by kind of the same configuration, but of course here you will give another store, the CMIS store implementation, and restart the server. That would mount a CMIS store. Now we've taken care of the document storage, and we'll need one more, and then we're almost done with everything in here. And the headline gives it away, clustering Elasticsearch. Now another favorite memory of mine is when a few colleagues have, and me, have visited a customer, and that customer was complaining to us that Liferay was actually not really properly working. Why was it not properly working? They were uploading a document, and then they searched for the document and they found it. When somebody else went to their server and searched for the document, they didn't find it in 50% of the cases. Now, what does that mean? They actually had search indexes local per server. Now, granted, this was back in the time when we didn't have Elasticsearch, when we had a literally local search index on every single server, but it neatly demonstrates what this exercise is about. When you have server number 1 and server number 2, and they both have their own private search index, and you upload a document to server number 1, it will cause an indexing operation for that search index. So if you then search for the content in full text, it will be stored in the search index. Now, one of the principles is you'll need to have the same search index on every single machine, or you'll have to re-index on all of the machines every now and then, which is an operation that nobody wants to do. So, Elasticsearch, I've told you up front, or in one of the earlier chapters, that we don't support any embedded Elasticsearch anyways, so you'll need a separate Elasticsearch installation no matter what. And that might as well be your central server for Elasticsearch. And well enough, it is actually quite easy to set up a clustered Elasticsearch, or a central Elasticsearch. And if you go through the exercises, then you can basically easily see how that works. Elasticsearch has an API, also has a web user interface where you can also query your installation, all of the data in there yourself. That's quite easy. All of the instructions are to be found in your material. And then let's finish with talking about Elasticsearch Shards and all of the clustering. Again, this is Liferay training, so basically I only give you half the knowledge about Elasticsearch, or like a fraction of the knowledge that you would get from an Elasticsearch training whatsoever. But you can create a cluster, or you should create a cluster of Elasticsearch machines anyways. And they have certain more concrete ideas about a cluster, which, for example, involves having an odd number of instances of their Elasticsearch ones, and the default. We have a few shards and replicas here. It says here replicas for high availability, and by default Liferay will create Elasticsearch will create 5 primary shards, 1 replica shards. What that is, what that does, well, I'll just tell you, there are clustering options for Elasticsearch we don't care too much about here. The exercise will give you a few of those hints. This is the central message that I want to give you out here on the audio track. We'll need a common Elasticsearch for all of our cluster machines, and then I'm happy for now. For production, of course, as with a database, as with a load balancer, you don't want a single point of failure. So you want several Elasticsearch servers that are actually highly available by themselves. That being said, exercise. We have prepared an Elasticsearch server for you. You can update the Docker files, build and start the containers, verify Liferay settings. Now you can see from this exercise that we are actually running with a separate Elasticsearch. We will only start Liferay when Elasticsearch is available. And that will conclude, for now, this chapter. And we can just review the 3 approaches to cluster the document repository, starting with the system settings, configuration file, or Portal X properties. We've used Portal X properties here, and well, we've used a mixture of both. By default, and I would add unfortunately, the document repository uses the simple file system store. Don't try putting too many files in there at once. But you will realize that lesson number 1 in performance tuning, if your documents load very, very, very slowly, you probably have an upgrade to do to Advanced File System Store or others. Advanced File System Store or both file system stores use local servers, local directories. And we have Elasticsearch as the default search engine. You can configure Solar as well. I didn't mention that so far. On the logical level, we need a common search index for everything. By default, we use Elasticsearch. If you want to use Solar, be my guest. You can do so as well. Not covered in this training. And Elasticsearch itself has many options to make it itself highly available, and all of them are configurable in Elasticsearch. That's the part that I personally don't really care about, because that's somebody else's business as of my system administration duties, but you may need to pay closer attention to it as well. That concludes my audio track, and I can safely point you to the written material, to the exercise, and let you go through the steps yourself. And with that, you will have a fully operational cluster with a load balancer where you can just access Liferay on localhost port 80. Bonus exercise, if you want to set up HA proxy for SSL, do that as well. It will be easier if you have a proper host name and make it available somewhere on the internet. Otherwise, just do it with a self-signed certificate. But that's bonus. I can't tell you how that really works, because that's all HA proxy configuration.